begin. First of all, thank you all so much for turning out on what's a rather wet, grey, cold night. It's lovely to see so many of you here for what is for us at the Biographers Club a really important evening, because we're celebrating Anne de Courcy's exceptional contribution to biography, and my goodness, what an exceptional contribution it has been. Anne has written 10 important biographies in the last 15 or so years, and we're here to celebrate those. It's the Exceptional Contribution Prize is a distinguished one. We've given it before to Richard Holmes, Hermione Lee, Hilary Spurling and Selina Hastings, and this year it's our great delight and pleasure to celebrate Anne. I first met Anne back at the Evening Standard, where we were both working in the late 1980s, and I was lucky enough to be assigned to Anne's desk. She was a grande dame at the Evening Standard. I was a rookie journalist, and she was, unusually for a journalist, immensely kind to newcomers and young people, or younger people. In those days, the Evening Standard was quite a force. It was a sort of cradle for biography in a way. A.N. Wilson was the literary editor. He won this award last year. John Walsh and John Preston were successive arts editors. Milton Schulman was reviewing theatre. Alexander Walker covered the films. Brian Seal was writing on art. And all of them were or became biographers in their particular fields. So, Anne, I hope that you're going to tell us a little bit about your entry into journalism and some of those early days, which were extraordinary.
Well, they really were. I mean, the first thing to say is that you simply wouldn't recognise the newspaper office of then compared with now. It was under the thumb of the unions. Alcohol flowed through it, rather like Lady Eden said the Suez Canal flowed through her husband's drawing room. People, as I say, drank like fishes, they smoked, and it wasn't, we all of course had typewriters. It was before computers came in the mid-80s. We all had noisy typewriters, and above all, it wasn't open plan, because you'd have been driven mad by 200 noisy typewriters. There were all sorts of rooms, nooks and crannies. There were little rooms in which I think elderly men had lived for years. Some of them, I think, didn't come out in daylight. Been there. People were grouped very often, and all the sports people would have been in one room. And there were lots of secretaries. Most of the senior editors and executives had secretaries, and these rooms were often very useful for purposes for which they had not been designed. It's the best way I think I can put it. One of those in particular sticks in my mind, I'm afraid. I should stress that all these relationships, I should stress that there was not a whiff of Me Too about them. They were all consensual, and sometimes, as Donald Trump would no doubt say, bigly consensual. Well, one of these, it was a very nice managing editor on the Standard, and he was having a relationship with his secretary. Well, on the Standard, you started very early, 7:30 or 8, and you went home at about 4. It was rather like a flock of starlings leaving to roost. The office cleared like that. And then, in came the cleaners. And these two used to stay late to catch up in work. And one never to be forgotten evening, they forgot to lock the door. I mean, whether it was a fit of consensualness or whether just absent-mindedness, I don't know. And in came a cleaner to find them in flagranti on his desk. And the story went like wildfire around the office the next day, was that this admirable woman, without missing a beat, had simply said, "Shall I dust brand you, sir?" Well, now we move on to alcohol. How, as Jane just reminded me, some people went out for 5-hour lunches and came back and wrote 1,000 words, I shall never know. There were some people, the real old soaks, who couldn't really go more than an hour or two without a stiffener. And you could always tell them because they would keep a spare jacket in their bottom drawer, so that before they went out they would hook it over the back of the chair, so that anybody who came along, oh, his jacket's still here, he must be somewhere in the building. So there was that. And I remember Peregrine Worsthorne telling me that when he edited The Telegraph, one day a story came in that he had a particular writer in mind that he wanted to write the story. He goes to the man's desk. He's absolutely out of it. He's completely blind drunk, head in his arms on his typewriter, fast asleep. Peregrine shook him and just said, go away, go. So when he came to, Peregrine sacked him. And the next minute, in came a couple of Union heavies. You can't do that. And he said, but he was drunk. Well, he may have had a drop too much. After all, we all do, don't we? And Peregrine bit back the words, speak for yourself, and said, but he was asleep. Well, nap can be very refreshing. Anyway, they had a ding-dong in his office, and eventually they came to a compromise whereby if the man could actually walk to his desk, you couldn't sack him. But if he had to be carried, you could. Well, now, the unions, the other thing, were they in your time as well, Jane, or had you got rid of them?
Yes, they were slightly losing
I think they were losing their grip, weren't they, then? Yes.
Yeah.
But they were terribly powerful. There were 5 or possibly 6, but certainly 5 to every paper, branches of these unions. And they would play you off one against the other. Any one of them could have brought the place to a standstill. Either the printers wouldn't have printed, or the Sogat men wouldn't have carried the papers out, or the electricians would have switched the power off. So you more or less had to give in to them, because if you didn't, your competitors would, the readers, people read a lot more newspapers then, they might go to your competitor, and heavens, they might stay with your competitor. And if your circulation went down, your advertising rates went down, and so you lost money. So you had to be very careful. Some were stroppier than others. I remember once actually being, and they would use any excuse. I remember once being in the editor's office, talking about some piece I was going to write, and in came a couple of unmistakable Union heavies. And he said, you better go now, Anne. So I rushed out. And I heard later what had happened. They had come in because the paper that day was having a big colour picture on the front, which was rather a coup. And they had come in to say that Sogat, which was the people who carried the newspapers out to the vans and then distributed them, they needed a bonus because coloured ink weighed heavier than black ink. And he had to give in. But the very worst were the printers, who were extremely well paid. They were a complete closed shop. You couldn't be a printer unless you were a printer's son. And they had all sorts of what were called old Spanish practices, like, you know, you'd sign on for a Saturday shift, you'd stay half an hour and go home, and you got paid for the whole day. And there were Mickey Mouse shifts because they would sign the form Mickey Mouse on and still had to be paid. I mean, they would strike at the drop of a hat. And some of their sons, we had as little to do with the printers as we could, because if you accidentally kicked a cable, you were touching something you shouldn't touch, and they might down tools. So you didn't want to go down to the machine at all. So we had copy boys who did that. And I have to say, the most unusual offer I have ever had in my life came from a copy boy. I somehow got him a football or a football shirt signed by one of his idols. So he developed a huge crush on me. And he was a proper skinhead, or skinhead as they called them then. with bobber boots, with studs, you know, braces, shaven head. He'd come over to my desk in the morning, which was always my busiest time, because being an evening paper, give it a kick or two, I suppose, to see if his boots were still in working order. Sometimes he would go pink and ask me if I wanted some coffee. Occasionally he would make a remark that was completely out of place, like, "You ought to wear your skirt shorter, your legs are all right." And I would scowl at him. And then, one day I remember, in December, it was about mid-December, he came over, and there was an absolute bang, 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 bang against my desk, and I was just about to say, "Look, Mac, please." And he stopped. He said, "Anne?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I was wondering," "Yes, Mac." "I was wondering, was there anybody you wanted done over for Christmas?" So you see, it was all very different. And then, quite suddenly, in the mid-80s, everything changed. We got computers, I got Jane, we got open-plan offices, people stopped drinking, people would say proudly, "I just had mineral water for lunch." I just had, you know, it's completely changed, didn't it?
It certainly did. I hope this has given you some context for Anne's arrival in journalism and her subsequent career, which is what we really want to talk about, which is how journalism and biography kind of correspond with one another. And I think really the first area to perhaps think about is research. And you, Anne, I know, have always set great store by research, and you're a great believer that the facts are out there somewhere, and what the journalist has to do is to find them. And you might like to give us some examples of
yes, I mean, I think research is incredibly important, because to me, all good biographies, they're like icebergs. They have, the tip is the biography, there's endless research underneath, and you're always conscious of it if somebody's done a lot. It's not that they thrust it in your face, but somehow it's the way it's phrased, or possibly even a footnote, something, but you really have to do as much research as you can, or it gets a bit thin. And you see, journalism taught me an awful lot about biography. And the one thing being on the Mail taught me was the information, as you say, is out there somewhere. All you've got to do is find it. Impossible as it may seem, it is there. And I remember in my own case, once, Paul Dacre, who both of us adored, who I think was a brilliant editor, he called me and he wanted me to do a 6-part series about Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, with particular concentration on her early life, i.e. what boyfriends she had before she was married. Well, as it was an open book, you know, I opened my mouth to say, "But Paul, you know, it's impossible at all." And then I closed it again mercifully, because you didn't say no to Paul. And I went away and I thought, now how do I find out about this? All her London seasons had been recorded because she came to London. And then I thought, well, I'm sure she went to parties in Scotland, hunt balls or county balls or something. I wonder if there was anyone there. And so I went to the news desk and said, "Have we any contacts near Glamis? News agencies?" "Oh yes, here's a couple." So I ring them up. "Do you have any archives?" "Yes, we do." So I said, "Well, can you look through the years?" I gave them the years, I forgot what they are now. But I gave them the years and said, "I want every cutting you've got about Lady Elizabeth Beauclerk, as she was then." Anyway, and up came a lot, and they were mostly about these balls and parties, because you see, at that time when this was just after World War I, there were no pop stars, there were no nothing, and the doings of people like her were enormously interesting to everyone, so they would be recorded. Well, up came a lot of cuttings, and I noticed that in practically every party there was somebody called Jamie Murray. He was the son of the Earl of Murray, the fourth son. I was able to find out a bit about him. He was a very glamorous war hero, a couple of years older than her. And I thought, ho ho, I wonder if there's anything in this. So I looked up into Brett's, I found out who he'd been married to, his children, and eventually I found the telephone number and address of, I think it was his grandson, I can't remember whether it was his grandson or his very elderly son, rang up. Oh, he's in a nursing home in Yorkshire. Oh, could I have the number? They gave it to me, so I rang up the nursing home, asked to speak to the matron. This takes a long time to tell, but it took a long time to do. Asked to speak to the matron, told her what I was doing, and said, could you possibly ask him if he would talk to me? It's going to be a very nice piece. And she came back and said, he will talk to you at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I ring up. I talked to this man. He was charming. And I said, your father, he was obviously a great friend of Lady Elizabeth's. And he said, oh yes, he was the Duke of York's, the future king. His equerry. In fact, he introduced them. Oh, I said, I thought this was pretty good. And I said, he was very attractive, your father. And she was very pretty. Surely they must have been interested in each other. He said, oh yes, yes, it was first love. I thought, jackpot.
This is how scoops happen.
It was very lucky. And he then told me how his father had been sent to Oklahoma to get him out of the way.
Yeah.
And he told me then the ball that they'd met at. So I rushed off to the London Library. Country Life covered balls then. It was one given by Lord Farquhar. And there was a long description of ball, right down to the dress she was wearing and the flowers that decorated it. So I was able to paint a very good visual picture of this meeting, which pleased Paul, who obviously would have thought,
not
I told you so.
Not an easy one, please. One of the other aspects of journalism which always amazes me as a non-writing journalist is how in the Evening Standard we'd all arrive very early in the morning, because we had 5 editions in those days, and there would be a conference in the morning and the stories would be decided and then they'd be assigned to the writers. So Anne would be told at maybe 10 o'clock in the morning to go out and interview somebody, often somebody who might have been quite in distress or in an extraordinarily difficult situation, and come back and write a piece for that evening's newspaper, which involved doing some quick research, getting to the person physically, interviewing them, getting from them a really good and interesting story, and coming back and writing it. I mean, to me this is an absolute astonishment. I don't know how anybody does it. And I think you had one particular time, didn't you, when you had to go and see Susie Lampley's mother, just after her daughter had disappeared.
Her daughter disappeared, and they said, would I go? Mrs. Lampley wanted to see someone. I couldn't believe that. I walked up and down that road for 20 minutes, nerving myself. I thought, how can I intrude on this? It was an awful feeling. But when I actually got to the door, she practically pulled me inside. She really did want to talk to somebody. So, one talked and wrote a sympathetic piece, because what she was hoping was that it would draw people some information about this terrible thing that had happened to her. So with that in spirit in mind, one did it. But it was I hated
harrowing,
doing that.
harrowing thing to do.
Oh, so harrowing. I mean, most interviews, with what they now call celebrities, they want, and see, they need the publicity, and so that works all right.
One of the things that strikes me in all your biographies is the degree of sort of compassion that you show for your subjects, even when they're quite difficult people or with quite strange reputations. And do you think your journalistic skills have helped you in that respect to kind of appreciate people in the round, as it were?
Well, I think I feel very strongly that there's always another side to a story which we may not know about. And I also feel that we don't know what the person's background is very often. And if you've had a difficult upbringing, and some people have had awful upbringings and perhaps a great lack of love, I think with lack of love, I feel that affects people very much. And it very often shows in their behaviour, but not necessarily in the way you would expect. I think that is one of the things.
Interestingly, Anne, I mean, your life was sort of upended, I think, when Paul Dacre was made editor of the Daily Mail, and the very first person he wanted to take with him was Anne. There was a no poaching rule, so this was all very delicate, so it had to be done
we had to
with
meet
great
in
secrecy.
In basements.
But he got his way, as he tended to do. And at that point Anne went to work on the Mail, which was a very quite a hard taskmistress and a tough place to work. You know, a lot was expected of the writers there. But that was where Anne really began her biographical career. Her first book came in 2004, which is Edith, the Marchioness of Londonderry. And I wonder, Anne, if you could just talk a little bit about how you arrived at your subjects, what sparks your interest in a particular subject or group of people? Or,
well, this particular one,
yeah.
I really wanted to get started on a biography because I'd realised by this time that every interview is like a biography. It's just a mini one, except, of course, you have a libel lawyer leaning over your shoulder. Otherwise, it's, you know. Paul, there was something very inspiring about Paul as editor. I remember I met him when he came down to edit the Evening Standard. They were always given, future Daily Mail editors were given the Standard to edit as a sort of
dry run.
Yes. And everybody was absolutely terrified because he'd got this terribly tough reputation. And emails went backwards and forwards, do you remember? And finally, somebody sent one up despairingly to the Mail. Hasn't anybody got a good word to say for Paul Dacre? And to which the answer came back, no, but his mother's reconsidering. But I liked him from the word go. It was wonderful. The Standard had got very magazine-y, and it got back to being a newspaper.
Yeah.
And the thing about the Mail was, provided you could produce what they wanted, when they wanted, as quickly as they wanted, your life was your own.
So that gave you time to
think
about
other things.
other
Yes,
things
I mean, you were
wanted
either working flat out, or maybe you were sitting back. You could sit back for 3 days sometimes because you weren't needed, and that gave me plenty of time to do. I'm afraid, do other things. But Paul didn't mind people writing books.
No, I think he was quite keen on it actually.
Yes,
because
so
it
he
enhanced the reputation of the
Exactly,
writers, which was useful. But why the Marchioness of Londonderry?
Why? Well, that was through Annabel Goldsmith because I'd interviewed her for the Standard, and my book 1939 last season, Edith Londonderry had been one of the guests who attended a dinner party in Downing Street, and I'd had to do a potted biography of each guest. I'd done her, and that's, I think, how I met Annabel. And one day Annabel said to me, you ought to write about my grandmother. She was a fascinating woman.
Well, she certainly was.
And so that was why I started that.
And that was followed by Diana Mosley, who again was quite a controversial figure.
Yes, I adored Diana, I have to say. I was convinced from the word go she wouldn't have been a fascist if she hadn't met Mosley. And I once said to her, if you hadn't met Kit, which was what she always called Mosley, I said, what would you have been? She said, oh, I'd been a liberal, which was a perfectly respectable. You know. I wrote to her. She said somebody else was already writing her biography, so I wrote back saying I didn't mind, but could I come and talk to her about it? I went over to Paris to see her. We sort of clicked. And she fascinated me. She had huge charisma and charm. Andrew Wilson adored her. I remember asking him to lunch when she was over once, and I got a postcard from him afterwards saying, thank you for asking me at your old Nazis reunion.
Yes.
No,
Well, you did distance yourself from her politics to some
completely.
degree in the book.
Oh yes, I said
because
I
you came in for
I abhor them.
Yes, because there was a degree of sort of criticism about
Yes.
writing about her at all, wasn't there?
Yes, there was, but she was a fascinating person. And, you know, the Mitfords were fascinating.
They were.
I was able to interview, obviously not Nancy, she died, Decca, fortnight before she died, and obviously not Unity. I mean, Unity was Betty,
Yeah.
but there were others were all fascinating, and Pam became rather a friend. We used to go looking at churches together. But they were a fascinating family. So that was how I thought of that one.
Well, I mean, journalism has been called the first draft of history, and you are almost as much, I think, a social historian as you are a biographer. You know, these two strands marry brilliantly in your books. What was it like dealing with Lord Snowden?
Well, dealing with Lord Snowden, well, first of all, there had been, I think, one or two absolutely anodyne biographies, cuttings jobs done of him. First of all, there was getting him to consent. It took me a year. And really it was through using one's wits, psychology, I suppose. He rang me up once to correct me about some feature I'd done, and then he said he was going to Siberia, and I thought that sounded interesting. I didn't know. So I said, perhaps we could have lunch when you got back, thinking it might make a feature. He said, oh, he would love that. He rang up again, and I think I sent him a postcard, thinking he'd probably forgotten, would he like to have lunch one day? He leapt at it. And I thought he was an interesting figure. Nobody had written about him. And the thing that gave me confidence was, you know, when you go into a restaurant with a banquette seat, well, it's the custom, it's etiquette for the man to let the woman sit on the banquette seat so she can see and be seen. Tony always took it. And I thought, here is somebody who likes publicity. I have got a hope. Case of perseverance. So I wrote to him saying I would like to do his biography. I would give him an assurance that I wouldn't publish in his lifetime without his consent, and I would give full value to his charity work, which was very important to him. Whereas otherwise, I said, you'll only get somebody very down market, you know, sort of John Blake, doing a lurid biography of you. I put this to him, and he just looked out of the window. And so I said, oh, well, let's talk about something else. And then I tried again, and finally, the next time we had lunch, this was a year later, I said to him, Tony, it's look out of the window time again. I need to ask you. You had I will write you a letter when I get back to the office stating all these facts. You know, I would really like to know. And he then said, would you like to come round and look at my files? Well, I took that as a yes. And so I went round once a week for 2 years. I got him to write a letter to his friends saying that I was doing this biography. I gave him a letter drawn up by a lawyer saying, I will not publish in your lifetime without your consent. I wanted to be as honourable as I could. And then all this stuff came out. Masses and masses of stuff, and I thought, what do I do? And finally I thought, the only thing to do is to write it as if he is no longer with us, and he's going to read it, and if there's minor things he doesn't like, I'll tweak it. If not, I'll put it in the back burner. But I'm going to stick. He kept saying, when was it coming out? And so then, very nervously, my editor and I rang up and said, we've got the finished draft. And I got a letter. It was actually from Lucy, not Tony, saying neither Tony nor I wish to read it. Go ahead. So I went ahead, and he never spoke to me again.
I'm sure he admired it. I'm sure he did.
Well, I mean, you know, it was fairly controversial, I think. Well, he was a rather controversial person.
He certainly was. Certainly was. We serialised, I think, all your works.
You've been very
in the
kind
mail.
that
No,
way.
not kind at all. It's a great privilege. How do you feel about serialisation? I mean, there are mixed feelings about it, I know. I mean, some writers feel that an awful lot is given away. Others feel it's advantageous to sales. I mean, do you have a view about this? I mean, yours we sometimes serialise twice, I think.
Yes, you do. Well, I mean, serialisation from the writer's point of view, they used to be very profitable. They've dropped now. I mean, in the palmy days of serialisation, it did your bank account an awful lot of good, which was...
But do you think it was detrimental to sales?
It depends how big the serialisation was. I mean, I mean, how is Robert Hardman's book doing?
Well, I imagine it's doing very well. I think serialisation often helps sales, actually.
Yes, I think it does. I mean, if it's interesting, if it is, and particularly if it's a single extract, and that extract is very interesting, people are going to buy it.
I suppose what one should advise writers is to maintain as much control over things as they can. Not least headlines, which are always a source of...
Well, of course, headlines you can't, it's difficult to maintain control over.
Well, you can sort of ask for control, but it's quite difficult to achieve, because quite often newspapers just ignore.
I think they do. I mean, I've found that.
And we've had some very lurid headlines and some very unhappy authors in the past.
Yes.
And you review a good deal, Anne. Do you find that a useful... You review books a good deal. Do you find that a useful part of your...
Well, I love reviewing books because you see the new stuff that's coming, and how good a lot of it is. And if it isn't good, I always say so, because if it isn't good, why waste space on the page on a book that isn't good? See? And of course, the other thing I was going to say that newspapers really taught me, that you don't always get, is the importance of detail. I think it's very important. I think you've got to paint a picture in the reader's mind. I think this is very important. I used to draw and paint a lot when I was growing up, so I suppose I've got a fairly visual approach to biography, but I think it's so I always gather as much detail, literal physical detail, about anything, whether it's somebody's room or what they're wearing or that particular scene, so that I can build it up so that in my own mind I can actually see it. And then when it's in your own mind, all you have to do is describe it, like you would describe this room or any room, and it's much more vivid.
Well, of course, that's an important part of journalism, I think, is telling a story in a very concise way, and that always, I think, does probably require an awful lot of information. I mean, you've talked about the iceberg of the massive amount of information, but using only maybe that much of it to convey your message. So.
Yes, yes.
And you feel that applies in a full-length biography as much as a 1,000-word piece.
Yes, yes. You see, journalism does have detail a lot. That's what makes it vivid. And I mean, one of the things I notice in biographies, particularly with male biographers, is they never describe colours. You know, and I think that's frankly important. I mean, if you were writing about the 18th century, and instead of saying something in the 18th century, instead of saying a line of troops marched across the horizon, if you say a scarlet line marched, it's much more vivid, you see. It's things like that. I think the great difference is in journalism, people use an awful lot of adjectives. They have to. They're compressing stuff in a small space. I mean, do you remember the phase the Daily Mail went through using the word titillating the whole time? That was a great... Whereas I think in biographies, it's much better if you weed adjectives out. I mean, I like the, straightforward, rather Orwellian. It's got to be very readable, I think.
Well, your books are nothing if not
I think
every single
another
one
thing,
of them.
apropos of that, and this I did before I went to a newspaper, I did nothing but read Fowler's English usage for 6 months, because I think it's incredibly important really to know about grammar. I mean, things like knowing where only goes in a sentence.
Where does it go?
Well, it depends depends what the sentence is. You know, or when to use a that clause and when to use a which clause. Because if everything is flowing, otherwise you do it then flows and becomes readable. Whereas if it's slightly wrong, there's a sort of slight jolt, and you think, what was that? And you don't quite know. It's like a stone in a river.
Yeah, that's interesting.
This is, I do think that's, I mean, I know we all speak grammatically, but there's sort of fine-tuning it. I think it's very important.
I mentioned before your great generosity to other writers and to journalists. You've even started a literary festival, Anne. Tell us about that.
Well, we have this literary festival started by another colleague of mine, Victoria Summerley, in Biography. It's called the Biography Literary Festival. I live about 4 miles away. She lives actually in Biography. We're a tiny committee. Well, we always have an odd number in the committee, so you never have a deadlock. And we hold it in the church, and we get all sorts of writers to come. We give them a good time. We don't pay them, but we give them a good time. And it's really huge fun. And, you know, we give them food, they stay with us. It's just enjoyable.
And is it predominantly biographers, or do you have a mix?
We have it mixed, but it's quite a lot of biographers, I suppose, because these tend to be the ones I know. You see.
Yeah. That's a great thing to have done. You've talked a bit about the importance of a kind of moral imperative for a biographer, and interestingly, I think you were quite concerned about there's been a move towards memoir away from biography and a kind of me.
Yes, you see,
sense.
I get the feeling we're very much in a kind of low hum of me all around the place these days. I feel it very strongly. I mean, people are very concerned with themselves. I mean, I read a piece in the Daily Mail the other day about a woman who said she spent $4,000 a year on wellness. She had a breathing coach and an astrologer, I mean, all kinds of things like that. I first became aware of this kind of feeling of me. Look, this is me looking at the Mona Lisa. I first became aware of that. I think it was on a bridge in Rome when, you know, all those illegal immigrants who sell fake Chanel bags and fake Gucci sunglasses. Suddenly, they were all selling selfie sticks. That told me something. And since then, there's been a lot. You know, I'm not on social media, but I'm told people pose on Instagram, all that kind of thing. And really, it's a kind of navel gazing. They're thinking about themselves the whole time, and people write many more memoirs now than biographies.
Cradle to grave biographies.
Yes. Well, a lot of memoirs are very good. It's the kind, I don't like the kind that is how I overcame my grief, how I survived the menopause, how I had a baby, that sort of thing. You know.
We need a subgenre, really, don't we, to kind of just push all that to the side.
I mean, if it's my 10 years in the White House, that would be riveting, because you're writing about, and the thing about biography is you're not writing about yourself, you're writing about someone else. And I think people are, on the whole, better and happier when they're thinking about other people than when they're thinking about themselves. That's what I feel is the moral dimension. I think that's very important, that people do think about other people.
Well, all your books, Anne, are absolutely outward-looking and fascinating and life-enhancing. I think we might throw this open now, if anyone would like to ask anything. Sarah?
Okay. Actually, I'm going to 3 questions all in one, but they're very short. First of all, I completely agree, having been a reader for this year's Slightly Fox Prize. I think 90% are memoirs rather than biographies, which is horrifying to me. Secondly, do you read what you've written out loud to yourself?
No, but I can hear it in my head.
Right. And the third thing is, I think you were mostly published by Weidenfeld. Did George Weidenfeld take an interest in what you were doing?
No. No, he didn't really. Well, I suppose he did. I mean, he always embraced me if he saw me, but I think he did that to sort of practically everyone, so, you know.
You did have a very long and fruitful association with Weidenfeld and Nicholson, though, who are
Yes.
the preeminent
Yes.
publishers of biography.
Yes, I did. I was very lucky.
You know, I wonder how important that was to you and how
Oh, that was
valuable.
very important because I think they do biographies beautifully. They had the most wonderful copy editor. Oh, and that is the other thing. I think one of the other things journalism teaches you is that all writing is better when it's edited.
Yeah.
I mean, some people get very stroppy if you move a comma. And really, we all need editing. I mean, you've only got to look at American writers who, once they've made their name, nobody touches them. And the effect it has on them, they're always pretty wordy. They never use one word where 20 will do.
Anyone else? Yes, the gentleman there.
So from your experience and for each biography that you've been able to write, what are some things that have evolved and changed about your approach to writing this as a craft, and what are some things that have sort of remained unchanged?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
It's how things have changed in biography over your career.
Oh.
Whether you feel, have I got that right?
Yeah, what are some things about your approach that have changed, and
Some things
what are
about
things that have
has
sort
your
of
approach
remained
changed?
the same?
I don't think my approach has changed, but I do think biography has changed a bit. I do think it's got people are much more personal. They tend to bring themselves in much more, which is all part of the kind of me thing. You know, I mean, they will spend a chapter saying how they found, I don't know, some old letters, and spurred them to doing, you know, who cares? It's very
Lady in green.
Hello. I was wondering a bit more about your craft, and I think it maybe links to the me-ness. You say it's an iceberg that you have to deal with doing the research, then produce, but you do it so very quickly, and I'd love to know whether you spend more time on the research, or whether you spend more time on the writing, or whether you do the two in tandem with each other. And I wonder whether memoir has come into the ascendancy because the advances that a lot of people get with biography is simply insufficient to cover the costs of doing the research. So you have to have an academic post to be a historian and do the research in order to produce the books. That's just my theory. I'd love to know how you have done it.
Well, I think advances have dropped a lot. I was very lucky. I've always, when I started biography, I was actually a professional writer. I was writing, I was doing the day job, I was earning my living. But if you really want to write something, you know, you do it, whether you are earning money or not. I always think that you should do it in tandem with the day job, because as you say, the advances have got smaller and smaller. That's partly because there's so many books are coming out, far more books are coming out now, and I think the quality of most of them has declined because, you know, you get a lot of self-publishing, or some of those, you know, we can't all do 50 Shades of Grey, nor would we actually want to. But, so I think there's that. Research, a lot of it doesn't cost a frightful lot, because you can get an awful lot from the British Library or archives in Kew, and there's a lot of undiscovered stuff in various archives in places like Westminster or Hammersmith, or you'll find people's diaries there, the National War Museum. You can get an awful lot of stuff from that. I'm a tremendous believer in primary documents, first diaries and letters, and an awful lot of them, there's still an awful lot to be discovered, and you've got to pay your bus fare or your tube fare there, but that won't break you if you're really determined.
And which do you spend longer on, the research bit or the writing?
Hmm?
Do you spend longer on the research or the writing? Because you have a great rate of
I suppose
delivery.
the research, because if you've worked in a newspaper, you always write quickly. I mean, I'll go back over it. I mean, it comes to a point where I feel I actually have to start writing something, even if I haven't completed the research. But I'll probably write a chapter or two more to get the feel of it. You see, and it also makes me, it's quite daunting when you start a book, because it's, 100,000 words, it's quite a lot of words. And you feel, when you finally get to something like 60,000, you think, I think I'm on the downhill slope now. Because it is a bit like climbing a mountain.
Yes. I mean, did you feel that your editors at Weidenfeld in particular were helpful with that process of bringing a book to fruition, as it were?
No, because I didn't give it to them until I'd finished.
You didn't? No.
No, I didn't give it to them until I'd finished. And then they would sometimes come back with something, why don't you move this chunk to whatever it was.
Was that rather irritating?
No, because I was used to being edited on the Daily Mail. It's one of the places you are edited, and if you don't like it, you can lump it.
Too bad.
And so I was used to being edited, and I think people should be used to being. If it was really serious, and I'd said, well, I've got a bit more information coming or something, then they'd say, it was all very civilised. I had the other thing about Weidenfeld is it was a brilliant copy editor. Because it's terribly easy when you're writing, you use the same word in 2 adjacent paragraphs, and that is not very elegant. And you don't always notice it. The copy editor will notice it, and that's what's very good.
Giles, you've got a question.
Thank you, yes. Wonderful talk, loved it, absolutely, particularly because I was in the Evening Standard in 1979, so in that old bluesy period. But anyway, what I wanted to ask was, have you found with your publisher that you've been directed towards more commercial subjects? That is, do you choose the subject, or does the publisher choose the subject? Obviously you'd only work on something that you actually liked, but have you had subjects that you felt, I'd love to write on this, and the publisher says, not that one, no, well, it's something that will sell a bit better, obviously Snowden, wonderful subject.
No, they have once or twice suggested a subject. I wrote a piece in, I think it was a Standard, I interviewed 3 debutantes, and then the publisher said, would I write a book about debutantes at war? They thought of that subject. And the other one they thought of, which did very well, was the fishing fleet. Because I was a bit stuck on, what shall I write next? And they said, well, one of them said, why don't you write about the fishing fleet? And I said rather nervously, are you talking about the Cod Wars? Or Brixton trawlers? And they said, no, haven't you heard of it? And of course I hadn't. You see, and that was
a huge research job as well, wasn't
it? It was so difficult, because where do you start? Yeah. I went, of course, straight to the British Library in the India office, and they said, well, we've got nothing on single women who went out to India. But there are some trunks of letters, you can go through and see if there's any reference to them. So, that's the other thing, you really have to use your wits in research, and think what to do. In that case, I actually thought the sort of person who read the lady might easily have a relation who'd been to India. I don't know why I thought that, but I did. And so I wrote to Rachel Johnson and said, could I possibly send a letter, have it printed in the letters page? And she said, I'll do better than that, you can write an article. So I wrote a piece, and I got a lot of response from that, so that was one lot of people.
Very ingenious.
And then somebody told me that his parents had worked in Africa at the consular service, and they had a magazine called The Consul, or whatever it was. So I thought, if I put an advertisement in that, because the sort of person who would go to the consular service in Africa would probably also have relations who would have gone to India. And that brought in so you have to use your wits a lot when you're, I think that's one of the things that is very important. And I don't know, and I think psychology is, for instance, if I was interviewing a man who was a bit difficult, I would always dress in navy blue, because I think men subliminally find navy blue both authoritative and reassuring.
Yes.
Can I just throw something into the ring? I have a sort of prejudice, if you like, that journalists are incapable of writing decent books.
Oh.
But I mean, you're the exception that proves the rules. Can you explain this?
Thank you. What was that question?
The journalists are incapable of writing
Decent.
decent.
The journalists seem to be incapable of writing decent books, but you
even bring
clearly-
myself to say it.
But you clearly are the exception that proves
You
it.
know, I think
Social historian.
I think that is a misapprehension. I mean, you've only got to think of Max Hastings or Andrew Wilson or
Any number of people.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
I think that was a provocative
Yes.
intervention. Gillian.
A classic example of a very good journalist who couldn't write a book was Cathie White, who was a great friend.
oh really?
And the only book she ever managed to write was a memoir.
She wrote a very good cookery book.
Yes.
I thought it was extraordinarily
Cooking in the bed.
Did you?
all nice about it, but really it didn't tell one what it showed. It said nothing about what it was really like writing for Picture Post in the early days.
So,
It didn't, and she made an enormous production about the difficulty of writing it. Clearly she was absolutely honed in on 80,000, however many words it was, her articles were, I can't quite think at the moment, you know, and it wasn't her kind of thing.
perhaps she should have just stuck to short form journalism.
Yes, I mean, it is a different kind of thing. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think you must have been on the Standard when I was freelancing for it. In, I suppose, the late 70s, when Simon Jenkins, I forget if he was the feature editor or the editor by that time.
Editor.
He was editor by that time,
Yes, yes.
And literally, I simply suggested ideas, and they were nearly always accepted. And the only one I remember everybody absolutely refused to let me do, of course they did, I wanted to write an article about how incredibly feeble most adverts were. And somewhat naturally, they were not accepted.
That wouldn't have
I
gone
think
down
you
well.
had a question.
Was there a biography you wanted to write that you weren't able to because the person wouldn't cooperate or you couldn't get adequate research? Was there something you're just yearning to do that you either haven't done yet or you tried and it didn't work?
Yes, there was one. I very much wanted to do a biography of Edwina Mountbatten. There was one written by Janet Morgan, and I just somehow felt that was ages ago, and I somehow felt I could possibly bring in. I'd learnt a lot more about her, but I got such a snub from I think it was Lord Ramsay, and so it was after that I went back to Winecoats and they suggested fishing fleet. But I would like to have written about her.
Might you still?
Well, my eyes were a great problem now seeing, so.
So, as a biographer, how important is it for you to know your subject than when you don't? For instance, where you got to know Lord Snowden very well in person, but as for instance, Coco Chanel, probably you didn't get to know her as well as you got to know Lord Snowden. So, how important is it to get to know them in person?
Well, I think after Tony Snowden, I don't know if I would ever write a biography of a living person again. That probably answers it.
Did that put you off?
Well, it had its difficulties, you see, really.
Are you working on anything at the moment?
No,
No.
Lars.
Anyone else with a question? Yes.
Did you always want to write?
I don't know if want came into it. I suppose I felt about it like if somebody said to you, when you grow up, are you going to breathe? You don't think about it in the slightest. It's just sort of there. So it's like,
I'm not a writer, so I have no clue about that. But you clearly, it was in your blood from the
yes,
start.
but I didn't think about it. Really, I was too busy sort of living at the beginning and trying to survive.
Yeah. Well, how thankful we are that you have written all these books. And to go back to the exceptional contribution, you know, we're so pleased to have given this to Anne. Anne is one of our own. She was the chair of the Biographers Club, the last but one. We have Jane, our current chairman, with us here today. It's been a wonderful evening, Anne. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you.
And what an exciting evening it's been. I'm sure Anne would love to talk to you all more and sign books if you want to. I commend every single one of them to you. Thank you for coming.